Welcome everybody to November's SciCafe. This is a monthly virtual series that we do from the reserve. It is a chance to bring the science that's going on in the Bay to residents and other interested parties. We'll go for about an hour and have questions at the end. You can type your questions under the questions tab. There's on your I think it's on your left-hand side. On my right-hand side, there's a place to ask questions. Today we have Devin Resko with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. He is with the Fisheries Disaster Relief Program Coordinator, and he's going to tell us all about the upcoming FWC restoration of oysters. So, Devin, take it away.
Thanks, Anita. Good afternoon, everyone. So like Anita said, my name is Devin Resko. A few just housekeeping things for at least on my end. I am traveling right now, so I have friends, pit bulls all over the place. So if you hear barking, it's just dogs, it's not a problem. There's a little bit of a delay with my screen and the screen that everyone else is seeing. So if I start talking about the next slide and you don't see it transition, just give it a few minutes. And you'll see what I'm talking about here. So like I said, I have been traveling a lot, so I got a lot of travel words on the mind. So today's itinerary that we're going to be talking about for this hour and the talk, be forewarned, it's not a full hour, so it's only about 30 minutes or so there'll be plenty of time for questions and other types of chat and discussions. But today, what I'm going to be talking about today, some of the highlights is just a little bit of an introduction about myself. FWC is starting to have a lot more outreach regarding Apalachicola Bay oysters. I am kind of the main focal point of FWC's efforts currently, so I think it's good to help introduce myself to everyone because I hope we'll be seeing a lot of each other in the coming not only months but coming years as we get this restoration activity up off the ground. So a quick introduction, then I'll go straight into talking about Apalachicola Bay's oyster fishery. And FWC's research on the oyster fishery in Appalachia, as well as the research and the data from other entities. Something I'm going to stress multiple times throughout this presentation is that even though FWC is kind of the main focal entity for this work, we rely on a lot of different state agencies, universities, and local stakeholders. So I will definitely be using other entities' data when necessary. Then I'll talk about some of the current trends with the oysters in Apalachicola Bay that we are currently seeing today. And probably the second half of the presentation is really going to be focused on that last bullet, FWC's efforts in effective long-term restoration and management of Apalachicola Bay's oysters. So first, just a quick introduction slide on myself. Like Anita said, my name is Devin Resko, and I am the Fishery Disaster Relief Program Coordinator. What it means for this project is that I am the principal investigator for FWC's funding efforts for Apalachicola Bay's oyster restoration. Prior to this position, I was working on a lot of fishery disaster relief, so whether that be Hurricanes Irma or Michael, different types of COVID relief programs, whether with the USDA or with NOAA Fisheries. Prior to being the Fishery Disaster Relief Program Coordinator, I've been with FWC for 5 years. So prior to that, I was working in the artificial reefs subsection in the Division of Marine Fisheries Management, basically working on artificial reefs from Mexico Beach all the way to Pensacola. So a lot of the Western Panhandle, just west of Appalachia. With that work, I was a little bit more in the water, which was always fun, but I still do get to get out into Apalachicola Bay and with some of the local stakeholders, as well as some different research entities to look at the oysters in their current state. And then with my education, I got my bachelor's from Jacksonville University here in Florida, and then I moved to the University of Guam Marine Laboratory halfway around the world to get my master's. And like all great marine biologists, I was born and raised in Kansas. So I'm going to jump right into it. Apalachicola Bay oysters. I don't think I need to really harp on this too much, that we know it's quite an iconic fishery. People know Apalachicola Bay oysters. Some of these sub-bullets here, over 90% of Florida's commercially harvested oysters and approximately 10% of the nation's wild harvested oysters came from Apalachicola Bay. So it doesn't bear repeating that it is economically vital to Apalachicola Bay and Apalachicola, East Point and Franklin County at large. But oysters also have a lot of ecological importance. They not only provide habitat and food for commercially as well as recreationally important fish in the bay, but it also helps with filtering out a lot of the water and stabilizing the coastline. So it's not only good for the economy, it's also good ecologically speaking. But we did notice in the early 2010s, specifically in 2013, that the fishery did start to collapse, and a federal fisheries disaster was declared the same year in response to that collapse. Further on, in July of 2020, FWC approved rules to suspend wild harvest through 2025. A lot of the research that our research branch from FWC, FWRI, the Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. I'm in Franklin County, based in East Point. A lot of the research and data show that adult abundance as well as juvenile recruitment remain at historic lows. One small area of promise is that we are seeing some small areas that are showing some signs of rebound, but not as quickly, or more importantly, not as expansive as the researchers had hoped for. So this is a quick data figure going back through to the late 1980s all the way up to 2020 that shows not only statewide oyster landings, but as well as Franklin County. So this is a great figure to show just how much of the pie Franklin County has in regards to oyster landings. It's also important to note that, like I said in that previous slide, in 2013, when we did see that collapse, you can see from 2012 all the way to 2020, there is a stark decrease in oyster landings in Franklin County. Another figure with just different types of data, kind of showing the same thing going all the way back to 1990 to 2020, is both pounds as well as harvest, or pounds as well as the value of the harvest. You can see starting around in 2012 and really dropping in 2013, both pounds and catch decreased significantly. So something that I get asked a lot is, what was the cause of this collapse? Unfortunately, there's not one clear sign that we can point to that says that was the cause and that was the only cause. Some of the issues that have been brought up, of course, the decreased freshwater flow, so with droughts, as well as increased upstream use, the water flow into Apalachicola Bay significantly dropped. That in turn increases salinity. So not only does that stress out the oysters, but it also provides a better, more suitable habitat for the oyster predators, specifically the oyster drill. So oysters were not only getting stressed out by the increased salinity, but they were seeing increased predators. So kind of getting hit from both sides. We've also seen limited habitats. It's something I'll bring up multiple times in this project, or in this presentation, is what we've been seeing is that the oyster reefs have really been flattened out to almost look like a parking lot. And then also some research has shown that at times we thought that the bay may be spat limited, but definitely those three main factors that I mentioned before are certainly big signs that we can point to on why we saw the collapse here in 2013 that are shown both in this figure and the figure before that. So like I said, FWC, we have our research branch, the FWRI in East Point. So they use both above water on boats as well as divers in the water to collect a lot of the data that we use in making our management decisions. So some of the data that I'm going to show here, these are the methods that FWRI employs. So twice a year, both in the spring and in the fall, scuba divers will hop in using the quadrat that you can see on the bottom right there. In the figure to the left, that's approximately what it looks like on a good day. So it's very difficult, very murky to be able to work in these waters. But the scuba divers do it. They do it at all 15 stations, and they collect data, including the sample weight, the number and size of all live oysters, the number of recently dead oysters, and then, like I said, something that's really important for us to look at is the number of oyster predators that are present in these data collections. All the data is brought up and sorted right on the boat, and then the data is collected, quality. It's called QA/QC. Just make sure all the data looks good and is refined before we provide it to other entities to make sure that there's no errors in the data. So FWRI has broken it up into 3 sides of the bay, as you can see here, the west, central, and east. And those little yellow dots you see there are those monitoring stations that they routinely collect oyster data. So this figure here is a pretty complex figure, so I'm going to kind of walk you through it. So on the bottom, you see all the years broken up, like I said, into those 2 sampling efforts, the spring and in the fall. And then on the y-axis, you see the average legal-sized oyster density. So how many legal oysters we're seeing per square meter. So some of these thresholds have been discussed in the FDAX protocol. So 100 bags an acre, we are showing that the resource is depleted. Anything below that red line is showing significant depletion. That yellow line, the 200 bags an acre, we show limited harvest is possible. And then the 400, it's where we do hit, green means go. We had sustainable harvest that is possible from the data. Something that a lot of people have been bringing up is that 300 bags an acre. So I put it here in the purple dashed line. An important note is that, as you can see from the most recent data from 2021 going all the way back to 2015, the data, those bars that you're seeing there, we're not even close to surpassing the red line, the 100 bags an acre. So currently in 2021, both in spring and in fall, we are showing that the west, the east, as well as the central parts of the bay are all showing significant depletion on all of the monitoring sites that FWRI looks at. Some additional data that we collect is with mapping data. So it's important to know the current status of the reefs, particularly how tall they are. Like I said, we've seen a trend where the reefs have started to decline to flatten out and look like parking lots. So it's important for us to know what the current reefs look like. It'll help inform us on restoration efforts moving forward. So this vessel here, you don't need to read all the white bullets. This vessel is from the University of New Hampshire. FWC was contracted with the university to do a lot of the mapping efforts in Apalachicola Bay. So not only did they do 3D mapping and bottom profiling, but our FWRI staff went on the boat with them and did a lot of tonging data to ground truth the data that UNH was collecting to make sure that the mapping data matched up with the tonging data on what we were seeing. So the efforts of that provided this figure that you see here. So they looked at areas both throughout the bay, particularly on the eastern side where we are seeing a lot of current oysters, oyster populations that are looking and showing some promise. So some of the data that you're seeing here, so the dots, the brown is mud. Those are areas that are not conducive to any oyster restoration efforts. The yellow are hard bottom areas, but we're not seeing any oysters. So these are areas that could potentially be prime areas for restoration efforts moving forward. And then the green, like I said, green means go. Green is where we are seeing some promise. We are seeing live oyster populations. So kind of focusing in on the east side of the bay, this is a lot of that data. Like I said, brown is mud, yellow are areas that are bare but could support oyster populations in the future, and green is where we are seeing oysters currently. As you can see, these polygons, kind of the greenish, yellowish polygons, are areas where we've had recent restoration. So it makes sense where we've seen recent restoration, we would see promising oyster populations. But this is just FWC's data. As you can see, there's a lot of areas that we missed. We can't sample every single square meter or anything. So we do utilize data from other entities. Like I said, it's important that we work both with the state management agencies, the universities, as well as the local stakeholders. So this data is from Florida State, and it shows a lot of the promising signs that we're seeing on the eastern side of the bay, but not to the effect that we had hoped. But it does help inform us on ways to move forward with restoration. So this figure, this slide has a lot of figures with a lot of data. There's going to be no quiz. You don't really need to look at a lot of the data, but these are from 3 separate entities, from Department of Environmental Protection, DEP, Florida State and FWC, looking at a lot of the data, and this is this year's data, hot off the press. And what we're seeing is not promising. We are not seeing a lot of oysters in regards to bags per acre that we had hoped for. Some promising areas that we are seeing are here marked out in yellow, but like I said, we are seeing areas that are showing promise, but it's not to the level, and especially not to the spatial extent. They're not as big as we had hoped for. So to kind of throw all that data into some words, some of the recent mapping that the University of New Hampshire did suggests that there's approximately 2,000 acres of potential oyster habitat that remain in Apalachicola Bay. Those are those greens and those yellow dots that I showed you in those figures before. Now, while the oyster habitat of that 2,000 acres does show promise, the areas are degraded to a point where a lot of the culch does not support oyster spat settlement. It's bare. There's nothing there for the habitat, or there's no habitat there for the spat to settle on to, continue the oyster populations. But like I said, where we were seeing those green areas, currently the east and central sides of the bay, where recent restoration has been focused, are the main areas that we are seeing some oyster support, and likely represents the core of the oyster populations for Apalachicola Bay. Since 2015, just under $6 million in Deepwater Horizon oil spill funds have been spent in attempts to restore approximately 400 acres of oyster reef. And to date, this is again data hot off the press from our researchers, approximately 56 acres from one of the projects, the DEP Restore project, have densities of oysters that meet that traditional threshold, the 400 or the 300 bags per acre that was used to identify areas that we could open for sustainable commercial harvest. But in regards to opening that commercial harvest, some very important considerations is that if our harvest were to reopen on those 56 acres, it might not only delay the implementation or reduce the potential success of the upcoming NIFWIF restoration, the work that I'm going to be talking about in the second half of this presentation. As well as commercial tonging on those restored areas could undo a lot of the recent gains that we have been seeing in the last few years. And then something else to consider is that removal of the oysters in the harvest, as well as the habitat degradation from those commercial tonging activities, would likely increase the need or the time needed to restore the oyster populations in the bay. Basically, we need these 56 acres to continue to see progress for the rest of the bay. I was chatting with my dad about this, he's from Kansas, knows nothing about oysters other than that they're tasty. And I said, if we have 56 acres of 2,000, he's a football guy. So I said, we are on the 2 or 3 yard line going the other way. We have 97 yards to go until we score. So yes, we've seen some progress. We were at the goal line at 0 yards, and now we're at 2 or 3 yards. But we still have a long way to go until we can see some meaningful progress on the oyster populations as a whole, into where we can start to consider a lot of the reopening activities for commercial tonging for oysters. But the second half, I want to transition to FWC's efforts into hopefully, like I said, seeing meaningful restoration and management of Apalachicola Bay oysters moving forward. So this project is with NIFWIF. It's the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund. So if I ever say NIFWIF for the remainder of this presentation, it basically means our funding partners. So for this program, we have just over $20 million. It is focused on Apalachicola Bay as well as Suwannee Sound, but an important thing to note is that all restoration activities and funding is going to Apalachicola Bay. Nothing in this program is for restoration activities in Suwannee Sound. So that third bullet, the oyster restoration, like I just said, is going 100% to Apalachicola Bay, but the development of the oyster management plans are both for Apalachicola Bay and for Suwannee Sound. And something, like I said, I've said multiple times, is that there are multiple partnerships. A lot of these entities that you see over to the right there, a lot of universities and other state management agencies are very important to help in the collaboration of this project. But that last figure below, I think is very important and something I'm going to harp on continuously when I'm in this position, is that it's important for the local stakeholders to not only be involved to where they are listened to, but to make sure that they have a seat at the table and that they do have effective communication and collaboration with the researchers to make sure that everyone's on the same page moving forward. So starting kind of brief, or I guess bird's eye for this program and kind of working our way into more detailed work. This program is split into 2 stages. So the first stage is about $3.2 million, and it really focuses on data collection, the preliminary work of the harvest management systems, compiling a lot of the background data and data that's been done by other entities, as well as having a data workshop and a habitat restoration decision workshop. So the next few slides are going to be talking about a lot of these bullets that you see here. So a lot of the data collection, like I said, our research team, FWRI in East Point, is in the water, on the water, collecting a lot of data. So it's a good idea for us to have a baseline snapshot of the oyster population, so we know where we are. So when we do start the restoration activities, we can see how far we've progressed. So in Apalachicola Bay, it's not only oyster densities, but also spat densities, sedimentation rates, and predatory snail densities. A lot of the data they're taking in the water, some of the more the data regarding sedimentation and the predatory snail densities, they also take it back to the lab in East Point to collect some further information. In regards to the harvest management system, so FWC is really revamping our the way we manage oysters, because we don't have one plan that will fit everything. Something that works for Apalachicola Bay may not work for Suwannee Sound, and vice versa. So something that we're really excited to start doing is developing these regionally specific oyster fishery management plans. And it's important that it is stakeholder informed. So like I said, we're doing one for Apalachicola Bay as well as for Suwannee Sound, and each of those are going to be a piece of the puzzle in the larger statewide strategic oyster fishery management plan that FWC and multiple entities are working on together. And even though this is mentioned in stage 1, it will continue to progress throughout later stages of the program. And I think it's important to note that both Florida State and the University of Florida are helping FWC with this. And I know some of the grad students for those universities have been reaching out to do some preliminary work on. They really just want to chat with a lot of the local stakeholders and get a good feel of the best way to reopen, to manage all facets of what it takes to run an oyster fishery. So I know with the University of Florida, it's going to be Will Casola, and Florida State, it's going to be Betsy Mansfield. So if you see them, if you get a phone call or an email from them, or they come up to you around town, I would highly suggest chatting with them, being honest with them. If you just have nothing to say besides, hey, I think FWC should pack it up and go, just provide as much information as you can to them, because they are going to provide that information to FWC. That information is going to be vital to developing these regionally specific oyster management plans. So Will Casola, Betsy Mansfield, I know they're going to be out in Franklin County soon, emailing, phone calling, chatting with people. So I again, highly suggest chatting with them about oyster fisheries. Another part of the stage 1 is to compile a lot of the information and the data that's already been done. So that involves meeting with not only the state management agencies, but the university researchers. We really want to get together in a room, lock the door, and discuss all the work that's been done recently, what's worked and what hasn't worked. A lot of that, the good and the bad and the ugly, will better inform FWC moving forward with the restoration efforts. And as well as a habitat restoration decision, where we would take a lot of the data that's already been done, bring everyone together and talk about, in regards to restoration, where do we want to do it? What materials do we want to use? How high should we build the reefs, and how large should the reefs be by acres? And then of course, after those decisions would be discussed, we would meet with the public to further discuss our preliminary plans. And then we would move on to stage 2, which would be restoration in Apalachicola Bay, putting stuff in the water, to help continue to see some progress in the oyster populations in Appalachia. So a lot of those decisions that would be made at those workshops, the where, what, how high, and how much would be answered, and we'd move forward with restoration. And then a lot of the monitoring that FWRI would be doing would help inform management moving forward. So I want to provide some results of both the data and the restoration workshops. So the data collection workshop we did have with a lot of the state management agencies and the universities earlier this summer well, we're already in November, this summer of 2022. And then we met with a lot of those entities for the restoration workshop in September, where we had a lot of those questions to discuss. So NIFWIF, our funding partner, expressed concerns over approving the remaining money that we had in this program for restoration activities, mainly because when we did talk about what's worked and what hasn't worked, a lot of the past restoration that's been done in the bay did not perform as well as expected. I don't know if my webcam's visible to everyone, but we were hoping to get a lot of work or a lot of progress and a lot of oyster populations from the work that was done. And we only got, 50% or 40% of what we saw. They just didn't work as well as we had hoped. So there's kind of that quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. NIFWIF, they're our funding partner. They want to make sure that the funding, the money is used as efficiently as possible. So what this boils down to is that there's still a large number of unknowns still present. Even though we've done a lot of restoration activities in the past, 5, 6, 7 years or so, we still don't know the best way to do it. So something to help counteract that is to perform a large-scale pilot study. Florida State is also going to be conducting a complementary study, and FWRI is going to be conducting both sampling and monitoring oversight. This large-scale pilot study, utilizing both our study and Florida State study, FWC would have more data to construct and perform larger restoration activities with a larger chance of success. Basically, these pilot studies aim to turn a lot of the unknowns into knowns, so we would have a better game plan moving forward with restoration activities. So to kind of put it into a flow chart to kind of see where I envision us going with this work is, you got Florida State and you have FWC. So we've been discussing our plans for our pilot study, which I'll be discussing here in a few slides. But we will put our stuff in the water. We will start our pilot studies. Stuff will go in the water. We will continue to monitor it. We will then, after a set period of time, get together and talk about what's worked. Oh, Florida State, that part worked for you. Well, FWC, that part worked better for you. So let's go with that. We're really going to see what worked and what didn't work when testing a ton of different unknowns. Now, there's always the chance that we get together and nothing works. We didn't really see any positive reactions for the oyster populations from either pilot study. At that point, we would have to regroup with NIFWIF. We would have to internally regroup and discuss it with the local stakeholders as well on what's the best way moving forward. Maybe I'm a glass half full kind of guy, but I don't envision this happening. We're already seeing some promise, some of those green dots that I showed earlier in this presentation. So I really don't see us going down this road. Rather, if we do see promising results from either study or from both studies, we're going to kind of Frankenstein it together. We're going to take the best of Florida States and the best of FWCs and put it together for large-scale restoration. At that time, we will be ready to put all of our eggs, all of our millions that we have remaining for this project into one basket and move forward with large-scale restoration. We will continue monitoring it and gathering data off this restoration effort. And two things that kind of spin off of this large-scale restoration. First, we'll get the pros and cons for future restoration activities. What I really hope is that we will get a good blueprint, a good recipe moving forward. So if some additional funding comes down the pipeline in X amount of years, whether it's us or a university or another state management agency, they can go, hey, when FWC did that restoration activity in 2023 in Appalach, that worked really well. I think we should springboard off that, or maybe do it identically, and we can see some further promising results for Apalachicola Bay oysters. But more importantly, something that's going to spin off this large-scale restoration is that we'll have data to help inform FWC on management options for the local fishery. We'll have the best data hot off the press on the best way moving forward to reopen the fishery. So this, in a nutshell, is a very distilled workflow that I see moving forward on the adaptive management and restoration for Apalachicola Bay oysters. So getting into some details on the pilot study, two things that FWC is looking at are reef height and material size. So the reef height is going to be 1 feet and 2 feet, low and high respectively. And the material size are going to be both 6-inch and 12-inch, small and large, Florida limestone. Location are on the east side of Apalachicola Bay. It's important to put it in areas that are near oyster populations. We're not going to throw it on top of the green dots, but we want to put it close to those green dots. That's the best way that we've seen to help continue and snowball the promising results we're seeing of those green dots on the east side of Appalach. The reef size is about 1 acre, so not massive, but large enough to see some beneficial results to the ecosystem. I kind of think of it as if you're going to paint your living room and you get a few different paint swatches, you're not going to paint the whole room and go, you know what, I really don't like this yellow. You're going to paint a little bit, or you may paint one wall. So we want to use a reef size that's big enough to where we can gather meaningful data, but not so big that we spent, X amount of millions of dollars and it didn't work. So we want to be as fiscally responsible as possible. And with replicates, we do want this to be scientifically sound. So we're going to have approximately 5 to 7 different replicates of the treatments. So a lot of the monitoring criteria and effort that our FWRI staff are going to be doing, they're going to take data on the densities of live oysters that they're seeing, different size classes. It's good to know the spat, the juvenile, and the market size oysters, and hopefully seeing them progress into those market sizes. And then also looking at the culture weight and/or volume. And that's going to be done through diver excavated sampling as well as environmental monitoring equipment. We're going to put a lot more data and instruments in there to collect a lot of the environmental data to really know where best to put a lot of the oyster restoration efforts when we are ready for large scale restoration. But overall, the cost is just under $7 million for this pilot study that, again, scientifically sound, that produces approximately 24 acres of treated oyster habitat. So I want to get into the material size. So like I said, we're looking at both 6-inch and 12-inch Florida limestone. And mainly it's because, like I said, I've said multiple times throughout the presentation, there's some major concern about the overall degradation of the bay's reefs. I think this was a DEP diver that I was talking to, that those reefs that he said were a few feet had been flattened out and looked like a parking lot. So utilizing this large size material is an effective way to build up those reefs off the bottom. And then of course, testing two sizes is not only scientifically important, but strongly encouraged by our funding partner. So if no significant difference is observed between the two sizes, the 6-inch and the 12-inch, the tongable material would obviously be used for the harvestable reefs during the future large-scale restoration. If it's effective both ecologically and economically for the fishery, it's a win-win for us. There has been a proposal to layer smaller tongable sized rock over that 12-inch foundation. Some of the scientists have shown that, or have said that there's not much not much ecological benefit from that, but it would certainly benefit the local stakeholders to use that 12-inch rock to build up those reefs so they don't look like a parking lot, and then to layer smaller tongable rock on top of it to where the reef's up off the bottom and you have tongable rock on top of those reefs. There has been some talk to use the 12-inch reefs for this pilot study as permanent sanctuary reefs, which means that they are closed permanently to oystering. I will say that there's not been a lot of traction on this, so I really don't envision this really taking off and being something that we look into. If we do, we are specifically going to talk to the local stakeholders to find out where we should look to have sanctuary reefs. We're not going to go to Cap Point and put sanctuary reefs. We're not going to put areas that have been traditionally very productive for the oyster fishery, restore it, and then close it to fishing. That is not going to happen. If, like I said, I want to reiterate, if we do have any discussions on sanctuary reefs, we are going to talk with the local stakeholders to make sure that those sanctuary reefs go in areas that have traditionally not been fished. And then again, regarding the reef locations, we are, like I said, looking at the east side of Apalachicola Bay near oyster populations that we are seeing currently. Replicates 5 to 7, so just kind of meeting in the middle at 6 is approximately 24 acres of restoration. But it's also important to control for ecological conditions. The bay is complex. There are areas that the currents are ripping, salinities are different, which means oyster predators are different. It's a complex body of water, and so we're trying to control for it as much as we can in regards to having multiple replicates in this study. So the main steps in choosing the sites for the pilot study that we are currently working on is we're mapping all the recent restoration work as well as that mapping data from the University of New Hampshire to get basically a big map of the bay to show where all the restoration effort in the past 5, 6, 7 years have taken place. At that point, FWI will go out in the water or go out on the water, hop in and take a look at some of these areas to ground truth it to say, yes, this area is a prime location for this pilot study. And of course, we want to listen to the recommendations from the local stakeholders on these historically productive areas. My contact information is going to be at the last slide of this presentation, but by all means, send me an email, give me a call and say, hey, this area used to be great. We've seen it kind of dwindle. This is an area that I would like to see you guys focus in on for this restoration effort. I love hearing from the stakeholders and saying, yes, look here, don't look here, because that data goes right to me. Then I provide that to the scientists who are out in the water. So these are the 3 main steps that we have moving forward in choosing the sites for this pilot study. So like I said, this is a good figure of the University of New Hampshire's efforts. And right now, this is the area we are looking at. FWI is starting to focus in on a few other areas, more specifically within this circle. But again, I really want to listen to not only the secondary stakeholders, the university researchers and the state management agencies, but I also want to listen to the primary local stakeholders, the Franklin County oystermen. So some of the next steps, FWC has been compiling a lot of the feedback and the suggestions that we had from the oystermen and the community workshops last month. We're conducting additional FWC outreach events in the near future, like this one today. And we'll have continued both internal and external coordination in drafting a lot of this pilot study design. I picked a great time to go on holiday with this last week. I was on annual leave, but we have been seeing a lot of progress. And when I'm back in Tallahassee tomorrow in the office, we're going to continue that progress. We're going to be full steam ahead on drafting this pilot study. When the design, the methods, and the spend plan are prepared, they will, of course, be publicly available for review. And then at that time, FWC will submit our plans to NIFWF for approval. I imagine that's going to happen in the next 30 days. And then the goal is to have a contractor signed, contract done, and material in the water in the summer of next year. So just to kind of wrap up a lot of the stuff I've been chatting about here today, this program that FWC has with NIFWF for approximately $20 million is for preliminary data gathering and analyses, restoration efforts, and then stakeholder informed regionally specific oyster management plans. All of the restoration work that we have budgeted for this program is going to Apalachicola Bay, even though the stakeholder informed plans as well as the data gathering and analyses for both Appalachia and Suwannee Sound. Although the past restoration efforts in Appalachia did not meet their biological expectations, like I mentioned, they're still helpful. We're able to get some really good takeaways from a lot of these studies, which help construct kind of a roadmap to springboard off on what to do and what to avoid doing moving forward with this restoration budget that we have here. But the best way to be scientifically sound and fiscally responsible is to conduct this pilot study. So we're going to be doing the study that's going to test multiple reef heights, multiple material sizes beginning next year, and all that data that we get both from FWC's work as well as from Florida State's pilot studies are going to help inform us for large-scale restoration moving forward. And then something that I want to stress again is that successful oyster restoration here in Apalachicola Bay is really only going to be possible through the culmination of work from both the management entities, the university researchers, but also with the addition of the local stakeholders to make sure that they have a seat at the table for meaningful discussions moving forward on the best way for Apalachicola Bay oyster recovery. So I think I have about 18 or so minutes for any questions. That's my contact info there. That office phone goes, that is my office phone. I am the only one that picks up that number. That's my email. I'm in Appalachia a lot, whether that's for ABSI meetings or any type of ride-alongs. If there's any time where people say, hey, can you just come down for the evening and we can meet somewhere and just chat? I'm always, a day in Appalachia is always better than a day in my office in Tallahassee. So more often than not, I will take you up on that invitation. But I really think it's important to have these outreach events to be as transparent as possible on the best way that we are moving forward. But it's also important to hear from the local stakeholders to make sure that we do see a oyster fishery bounce back and rebound from the collapses that we have been seeing. Because everyone, whether it's FSU, UF, all the state management agencies, or the Franklin County oyster stakeholders, we all have the same objective, is to get an oyster fishery back up and running in Apalachicola Bay. So we're starting to see some progress. I'm just really hoping we can continue to see that progress and it'll really snowball into some real meaningful restoration and management moving forward in the coming years. So Anita, I'll hand it back off to you.
Thank you, Devin. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, we're having a little trouble here with our audio. Yes, so thank you so much. If anybody has questions, feel free to drop them in the question box or the chat. Okay, so David Alderstein has a question. David, you can come off mute if you'd like.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Basically what I wanted to ask, I know that you obviously want to do this preliminary study to get a hard number, a more exact picture, but based on the research done so far and based on principles of extrapolation and estimation, and based on basically all things being either the same or a restoration effort in keeping with the past ones, how long did it show it would take to get 400 bushels an acre in a bay?
Yeah, so that's something that FWC has been having a lot of discussion on what threshold do we need to surpass as a bay? Because when you think about it, now I don't have the data up in front of me, but if you have 3 reefs that are showing over 400 acres, or sorry, 400 bags an acre, how do you enforce only fishing off of that bay or that reef versus that reef? It would be a enforcement logistical nightmare. So one thing that our funding partner has kind of made clear is that, like, they want to see the restoration efforts at least start before any type of reopening happens. So they basically don't want us to put the $1 million in there and then that area kind of get mixed up in some of the areas that may be reopened or are, I wouldn't say intentionally being like poached. I'm not saying that at all, but it could be accidentally harvested because it's close to something that is open. So right now with this, like I said, doing a lot of these harvester informed management plans, we're really going back to the basics on what's the best way moving forward to reopen the bay effectively, both for the local harvesters, because we don't want you guys to be confused on, well, you can focus on that reef and that reef, but not those reefs before it, because that would be a logistical nightmare for you guys as well, but it would also be a nightmare for our researchers and for our enforcement agencies. So basically kind of peeling back the curtain on some of the work that we're doing internally is once we get this restoration effort for the pilot study up and running, so in the summer of next year, all of our focus is really going to be on the management side, on what's the best way to open. If we can open up, if we can open up early / partially early, yeah, win-win. Well, let's go for it. But by no means are we saying it's going to be 2025, even if we're seeing oysters everywhere. That is not what we are looking at. But we need to be scientifically and data informed and driven on a lot of these management questions. So I guess it's a long-winded way for me to say, hold that thought that we're going to be having those discussions internally and then bouncing those externally. Here, I would say in the spring of next year.
Could it be 2025? Is that still a possibility that you'll reach these thresholds in enough places that there will be openings in 2025?
Certainly, we have not had any internally with FWC as the agency that makes a lot of these management decisions. We have not had any discussions that said, "Hey, we're moving it over. Let's just talk about let's do 2030." We're just not going to say that yet. We have not had those talks. Because like I said, we want to be data driven. So if the data are showing promise, that's good. And if we're showing that the data are not showing promise and that nothing's really coming back besides these small little areas, that's going to have to be something that we discuss internally. But we really want to get the restoration efforts up and running and off the ground, and then focus our efforts on this management decisions. And like I said, sorry,
I got a real quick question. After the hurricane, after the coronavirus, all the outreaches with coronavirus, one of them was for seafood. Do you know whatever happened with that related to the COVID-19? There was federal monies put aside for it.
For outreach for?
No, not outreach, for compensation. In the same way they were compensating different businesses, there was a seafood component to it. I wrote a story, and I don't know whatever happened with it, if anybody.
Yeah, so was it specifically for seafood wholesalers, or was it for multiple sectors of the fishery?
I'm not sure, but it was definitely just limited to commercial seafood. I don't think it was for charter captains and stuff, but it was.
Gotcha.
I don't think it even had been well defined yet.
I think my screen's still showing. If you want to shoot me an email about that, because I also ran both of those programs. So we had one with the USDA that was specifically for seafood wholesalers. And then we had one with NOAA Fisheries that were for charter captains, commercial fishermen, aquaculture, wholesalers.
Okay.
I feel like there was one more. So I ran both of those programs. So shoot me an email and I can give you a call sometime. I know it's kind of squirrely with the holidays coming up, but we can certainly chat about that here in the near future.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How hard-nosed is NIFWIF being about this in terms of them being with the additional, what is it, 16 million or something?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that they're they have us on a shock collar or anything like that. They have $20 million, and they want to make sure that FWC spends that $20 million in a fiscally responsible manner. I tend to agree with in regards to doing this pilot study. So the pilot study was not initially in our plan. We were going to do a lot of this preliminary work. We were going to build a game plan moving forward, and all the money was going to go towards restoration efforts in Appalachia. But it became more and more clear that, like I said, a lot of the programs we saw promise, but we didn't see as much promise as we had hoped. We really didn't meet those benchmarks that we had really hoped for. So I really can't blame them on saying, you know, we want to make sure that this money is spent well. So kind of go back to the whiteboard, do a pilot study, look at multiple different treatments. Like overall, we're looking at 4 different treatments here. And then with FSU's work, we'll have even more. And then at that point, we'll be able to take, you know, the best from both projects moving forward on large scale restoration. So really, I can't fault them for them. And I kind of feel like if I was in their position, I would have brought up a nearly identical request.
Is there any talk about, would it use barges, or would it use shelling by oystermen, or how how restoration would be done?
Yeah, so with the Florida limestone, we are going to be using barges. And so that's our, we have some other individuals who have done a lot of that restoration effort on the, you know, boots on the ground kind of efforts. So they have a little bit more details on the specifics on that. But I think it's going to be with it's an excavator. I guess that's the correct term for that, to be able to put the Florida limestone in the correct areas.
This is not shell. This is limestone. This is not
correct.
Restoration.
Okay. Yeah, so it's something that's been shown in those studies that the shell, I mean, shell's the most natural thing to use in the bay. That with it being such a complex body, that shell can get swept out pretty quickly from some of these currents. It can kind of get buried a little bit. And with the reefs being so degraded and depleted, we really need to use that rock to kind of build up those reefs. And some of this Florida limestone in previous, in previous studies have shown some real promise. So we're really excited with this Florida limestone.
Thank you, David, for those questions. Let me get myself on camera again. It's working. There we go. Thank you so much, Devin. The talk was great, very informative. You hit a lot of great points and a lot of great questions there. We would like to invite you all to join us next month, December 15th from 3 to 4 for a talk, a SciCafe with Matt Condolf. He is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and he's going to be talking about an adaptive management approach for restoring lateral connectivity in the Apalachicola River floodplain. So we just wanted to extend that out to all of you. And thank you again, Devin, for talking today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And again, if anyone wants to reach out to me, send me an email, give me a call. I'd be happy to listen to you guys and have some back and forth on the best way moving forward here.
Okay. Well, see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.